Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am going to introduce you to all of our speakers today and give you a chance to listen to them. But before we get there, I have a couple of housekeeping things we have to take care of. Of course, I'm sure everyone is very, very used to doing a lot of Zoom calls at this point. It's been a long 8 months, but just as a reminder, please mute yourself. That includes our speakers. When it's not your turn, please put yourself on mute. I'm sure we've all been on calls where someone has been vacuuming in the background. It's extremely distracting and annoying, and I'm sure we'd all appreciate silence when we're listening to our presenters. Now we're going to listen to all of our esteemed colleagues speak for a few minutes, and at the end of all of those presentations, there is going to be an opportunity for a question and answer period. You can type your questions into the chat, and at any point in time, just make sure you include your name, the name of your organization, and the speaker who you're addressing your question to. We're going to try to get to all of them. We'll have about 15 or 20 minutes on the back end for all of those questions. So do try to keep your questions a little bit simple so we can get to as many as possible. If you're following along on social media, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag #ClimateSecurity2020, spelled just how it sounds. And the last thing I want to tell you that today's event is actually a prelude for a larger conference on the impact of climate change on human security. It's scheduled for March of next year. You'll have a little more of that information at the end of the session, so make sure you stick around for that. Now, without further ado, let's get to what you're all here for. Our first speaker is James Graebert. He heads the Mitigation Division for the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat. He's also the Secretariat's Communication and Engagement Division. He's the head of that. He has served as a greenhouse gas emissions specialist and has worked in numerous expert groups on the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So, James, why don't you take it away?
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Let me start by saying that the security community is well aware of the fact that climate change is already a security issue affecting the world today, one that will only increase over time if we fail to act. The global pressures on food, water, energy, and other resources are increasing. Climate change is the threat multiplier that worsens social, economic, and environmental pressures, leading to social upheaval and possibly even violent conflict. I believe it is too often climate change is presented by the media or the politician as an energy story or a natural resource story or a weather story. The public hears about solar and wind or other clean energy developments, or we hear news about how climate change will impact the resources we rely on, water, food, healthy ecosystems. And we certainly hear when climate change is linked to deadly and costly extreme weather, supercharged storms, prolonged droughts, and devastating floods. The narrative must go beyond climate change simply driving droughts, supercharged storms, or resource scarcity. The story must be carried forward to show that already vulnerable communities become more desperate, more vulnerable, and more susceptible. People are displaced in their country or to other countries. And in conflict with predatory criminals or several concurrent crises, and your humanitarian situation quickly escalates into a security risk. This story, this narrative, this link between a stable climate and human development needed for security, this is a story that needs to be told. If we fail to reduce emissions and build our capacity to cope with impacts over the long term, climate change will result in more disruption, more instability, and more displacements as impacts intensify. The world will be less stable, less secure. So what needs to happen to avert this ongoing and escalating threat to human security? Well, first, governments must significantly and immediately boost their climate change ambition and be accountable for meeting their pledges. We must slash emissions as soon as possible, 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. There's no separate path. There's no alternative universe. This is what we must do. Ambition on this front is crucial, but so is the need for climate ambition in specific areas such as mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation, and finance. National governments are not solely responsible for this work, however. Businesses throughout the world must align their goals with the Paris Agreement. Simply put, business as usual is an investment plan in failure over the long term. Those who don't take steps now to align their work with global climate change goals will soon be out of business. This means that we must minimize the creation of carbon-intensive infrastructure. This will determine the mission's pathway of the next decades by enacting policies that promote green growth, protect biodiversity, embrace renewable energy, and more. It means a deep transformation must take place in all facets of life and how we live it, including in transportation, construction, production, supply chains, our relationships with the natural world, and many, many more areas. The central blueprints to protect people and planet already exist. The 2015 Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda, what we need is to complete the work remaining under each and continually increase the ambition. The second essential ingredient is to plan for a resilient future. Let's remember that in the last 5 decades, humanity has collectively made significant progress on some of its greatest challenges, including slashing extreme poverty, eradicating major diseases, boosting vaccination levels, improving access to education for women and children, and many, many more areas. But this won't come overnight. In each of these advancements, we had to clearly state the goal and then get to work developing the plans and policies, strengthening logistics and legislation to reach them. Never was the path easy, nor will ours be. And yet, to build a resilient future, mitigation is not enough. The climate emergency is already here and people are already suffering. It's not about giving up, it's about facing reality. That's why we must see strong adaptation strategies that enable effective recovery from environmental hazards and build long-term resilience to those hazards. The third essential ingredient for success is a just transition. Because climate change impacts all of us, we must put our divisions aside and work together to address it. We must also learn the lessons of history. We cannot repeat the same old stories we've seen many times in the past, when great transition and change have resulted in people and entire nations falling by the wayside. We must therefore ensure the transformation to a more renewable future is a just transition. What does that mean? It means governments establishing the programs and policies that will help people make a transition to the new industries. Jobs related to renewable energy are growing exponentially, but if people don't have the skills to work in those areas, we will have big problems. We want the age of renewable energy to improve the lives of workers, not in their livelihoods. Boosting ambition, building a more resilient future, and providing a just transition, those are 3 key elements we need to unleash the true power of the Paris Agreement and build a cleaner, greener, and healthier future. So increasing ambition, building the resilience, and a just transition are the key ingredients for preventing the worst impacts on human security from climate change as well. All these things need to be done by all of us, the governments, the corporations, and individuals. And of course, this includes the members of the security community. And we look forward to working with all of you to achieve this. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Appreciate that. Our next speaker is the Honorable Sherry Goodman. She is a senior strategist and advisory board member at the Center for Climate and Security. She's the chair of the board at the Council on Strategic Risks, the Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, and senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center's Polar Institute and Environmental Change and Security Program. That's an impressive resume. She has also served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. So, Sherry, why don't you take it away?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and this is a very distinguished lineup. And I'm really pleased to be speaking to my friends and colleagues in Canada. I think this is highly important. I think back to my years serving as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security in the 1990s. And we had a lot of collaboration with the Canadian military and with other agencies within Canada to address the environmental issues of that day, which was in large measure cleaning up contaminated sites from the past, military activities, but also protecting our Arctic regions. And nowhere is the evidence of climate risk more apparent than in the dramatically changing Arctic. As you well know, as an Arctic nation, you know, a whole new ocean has opened in our lifetime, and temperatures have reached record levels, including in parts of Canada, the US and Russia and Siberia, up to 100 degrees, and 70 in parts of Canada and Svalbard this summer, the second lowest sea ice ever recorded. The sea ice is retreating, temperatures are rising, and the permafrost is thawing, changing lives and livelihoods for many in the region and perhaps heralding a next era of geostrategic competition. Now, I was so pleased to hear Jim talk about the threat multiplier. So that's a term I coined in 2007 when we formed the CNA Military Advisory Board, which is the first group of military leaders, senior military leaders, to address the national security implications of climate change. We spent a year studying from the world's leading climate scientists in 2006 and 2007. And we were aware even then that climate change would pose a serious risk to stability and human security globally. I'm very pleased to also share with you today our Canadian colleagues, because we've been talking about this for so much time. And I'll admit, in the US, we still have a lot of progress to make, but we have an important election coming up in just 2 weeks' time, less than 2 weeks now. We're counting down the days. We have now formed an International Military Council on Climate and Security, which is very important because these are now military from 35 nations around the world that have come together with their associated think tank and other research organizations to address the climate and security challenge. And because militaries are respected institutions in their societies, and because they're big energy users, and because they often have military bases that need to become resilient, like many of our communities and towns, they can lead by example, and they should. And so I just spent the last couple of days in a conference with military leaders organized by the UK, which is leading the next Conference of the Parties on Climate Change, coming up next year, in the hope that there will be a defense minister's declaration on climate and security. Now, the International Military Council on Climate and Security has identified those major risks that our last speaker just talked about, from increasing global water security risk, water insecurity worldwide, which is threatening so many people now. Okay, well, I hear the bell, so I'm going to go right to I'm not going to touch on all of those risks, but I'm going to say the opportunities are there. And NATO in particular, since this is a NATO Association meeting, is now developing its first strategic concept that includes climate security. And that's very important because that will enable the security community across NATO to address this. And we're very hopeful that we've already produced the first World Climate Security Report of the International Military Council on Climate Security. We're working on the second. We hope to join with some of you in looking at those regional specific risks across the Pacific, Latin America, and the Arctic, which will lead to further cooperation and ways to build that resilience that we need, move towards a clean energy transition that is also just for all peoples. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay, so far so good. Everyone's respecting their time. Thank you, Sherry. I appreciate everybody sticking to their allotted time so I don't have to jump in and cut anybody off. The next up, we have the Honorable John Conger, who is the Director of the Center for Climate and Security, where he oversees all of the Center's programs. He's also the chair of the Climate and Security Advisory Group, and he is a member of the National Security, Military, and Intelligence Panel on Climate Change. He is also a senior U.S. advisor to the International Military Council on Climate Change and Security. So, John, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Thank you very much, Justin, and thank you to the NATO Association of Canada and the Climate Solutions Advancement Network for holding this forum and inviting me to make remarks about the security implications of climate change. I'll add one other piece to my bio, which is in the last administration, I worked for the Department of Defense and oversaw all of the installations and environmental programs and the climate change portfolio as well. And so I have, from a U.S. Department of Defense perspective and from a military perspective, sort of an answer to the question of why they care about climate change in the first place. We've sort of built on that, and I will say that it was a natural fit for me to come over to the Center for Climate and Security, which is a Washington-based think tank, to work on this very set of focused issues. So why does the military care about climate change in the first place? I think that One particular answer is that it's all about mission. So despite changes in administration, I think you'll find that the Department of Defense and the military still pays attention to this issue. It is both because it affects sort of mission today, it affects readiness, extreme weather can affect, level bases, wildfires can force evacuations. There's a whole host of imminent climate effects that are only going to get worse that affect the way they do business. Second, there's a whole new set of missions that's going to come as climate changes and the whole globe sort of shifts the way it looks. The best example of this, and Sherry alluded to it, is the Arctic, where you're going to have a whole new ocean to patrol in the decades to come, and that changes the entire global environment and the geopolitical environment, how folks are going to interact. And I think the third thing is going to geopolitics, and as was mentioned earlier, fragile nations certainly are going to be impacted by climate stresses, whether that's water scarcity or food insecurity, sea level rise. When you're already wrestling with all of the challenges you have, and climate layers on top of that and makes things more difficult, that's going to drive instability. It's going to drive migration and conceivably conflict. So as we think about these things and we think about those categories, DoD sees it as or the Department of Defense in the United States sees this as a national security issue at a very basic level. So I think that Canada's armed forces and Canada's national security enterprise is going to be looking at it in much the same way, but to different degrees, right? So Arctic becomes a much bigger focus. Obviously, Canada has bigger Arctic equities. You've still got storms that are going to affect populations inside the country. You're still going to have intense wildfires, and the military often gets called in to respond to these. So they're going to have to take this into account as they think this through. I can go into more detail on Canada's equities. I'm seeing the 1 minute left symbol, so I want to hit one more thing. We did a report earlier this year called the Security Threat Assessment on Global Climate Change. We were looking at what were the increase. I already talked about current security problems, current reasons why militaries care about this. As we go up to 2 degrees or 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels, what are the new security challenges we're going to face? Well, we did an assessment and analysis, and basically we're looking at increased instability. Those fragile nations that are having problems today will have larger ungoverned spaces. We're going to have places that are going to be increasingly uninhabitable, and that's going to force people to move. And they're largely going to move to places where people already live, and that's going to cause conflict and tension. So as you think about this, the conclusion that we reached, and we are a security think tank, not an environmental think tank, but as we think about it from a security perspective, we reached the conclusion that to avoid catastrophic impacts, you're going to have to reach a net zero emissions as soon as possible in order to avoid these future problems. The emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere are going to cause problems for the next couple of decades, even if we went to zero emissions tomorrow. But we are looking to avoid the catastrophic futures that we would have, that our kids are going to face in the distant future. And so that's why we concluded that however it's done, the world has to get to net zero emissions as soon as possible. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Next up, we're hearing from Michael Collins. He's the Executive Director of the Americas at the Institute for Economics and Peace, or the IEP. In his role, he developed partnerships with governments, civil society organizations, foundations, or other organizations with the goal of expanding the uses of IEP's positive peace framework. Prior to joining the IEP, he oversaw education, job creation, and economic development programs in emerging nations recovering from natural disasters. So, Michael, I know you have a presentation to show us, so why don't you take it away?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Justin. And I wanted to sort of very quickly share some results of the ecological threat register as a way of kind of sort of further highlighting the connection between climate change and the sort of political, social, and economic factors, and potentially add some sort of additional specific numbers to the main comments that John had as well. So The Ecological Threat Register is an IP report. Essentially what it does is it compares countries' exposure to ecological threats over the next 30 years with their underlying level of resilience currently. So the aim of that is to be able to identify essentially countries that are most vulnerable in order to be able to sort of more closely coordinate climate adaptation. And perhaps, also kind of sort of note that this element, whereas climate action continues to be incredibly important, our focus is mainly on the adaptation component. So the Ecological Threat Register, it covers 157 countries with 8 different indicators related to food security, water stress, population growth, and then elements related to natural disasters, including droughts, floods, sea levels, cyclones, storms, temperature rises, and sea level rises as well. Now, of course, these are sort of in many ways independent from climate change, but as Sherry very duly noted, climate change acts as a threat multiplier. So obviously needs to be taken into account. So in terms of sort of some of the main findings, I'm just going to stick to the general map here. We find that 141 countries are going to be exposed to at least one ecological threat between now and 2050. Just under half of them are going to be exposed to 2 or more. So there are kind of sort of 16 countries which don't reach the threshold of having an ecological threat according to the measure that we use. And those are primarily countries with high or very high levels of peace. Essentially over 80% of those are countries with high levels of peace. So, Switzerland, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Costa Rica, for example. And I bring that to your attention because that's largely sort of a result or a theme, pervasive theme through the research there. And that is kind of sort of the symbiotic and cyclical connection between resource scarcity and levels of peacefulness. So, for example, out of the 19 countries that are subject to 4 threats or more, over half of them are in the 40 least peaceful countries on Earth. In fact, a lot of them are going to be sort of what you consider to be the usual suspects here on the left-hand side. Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria specifically are the 3 least peaceful countries on Earth. Now, many of these countries are actually expected to double their population within the next 30 years as well. So when we actually look at population growth, we also see a significant correlation here between very high levels of population growth and lower levels of peacefulness as well. This is kind of sort of a more simple chart showing the same thing. This is also a breakdown of population growth according to levels of peace, and we see significantly higher population growth in countries with lower levels of peace. Now, we've done some very preliminary research for the upcoming Global Terrorism Index, another report that we produced, which also compares population to growth with the countries most affected by terrorism in 2019. Now, all but one of these, this is just for Africa, bear in mind. We are doing this globally, but that will be in the report. All but one are countries that are expecting a very high level of population growth. And when we look at the increases in terrorism also, that is also taking into account. And to the extent that we see a very close correlation between population growth and resource scarcity, more broadly, food security and water stress, that's also something very important to take into account. So this map that I showed you a minute ago is kind of sort of somewhat misrepresentative of the risk. When we take into account the underlying level of resilience, what we see is a slightly different map. We see 3 very clearly defined belts here in the Sahel region, in the Southern Africa region, and then the MENA and Central Asia, from Syria to Pakistan, essentially. These are 31 ecological hotspots that we identify as countries being in an exceptional state of risk over the next 30 years. And this kind of sort of speaks more broadly, once again, to how resource degradation leads to conflict, weakening of institutions, and then those weakening institutions, less capacity to be able to deal with the upcoming crisis, and therefore this vicious cycle that many of these countries are subject to. Now, just slightly more closer to home, this is a drop in positive peace, our measure of resilience in the United States over the last 10 years. What we see is a significant deterioration in things like quality of information, factionalized elites, group grievances. many of which correlate or run parallel or preceding a lot of the upticks in civil unrest that we're seeing here in the US. Now, I have to say that this is something that we're seeing on a global basis as well, but it kind of sort of, really takes us from the position of thinking of this as an external need of other countries that may be a lot more fragile than ours to something that is incredibly relevant to us today. The reason I say that is because these properties of resilience that enable us to resist forms of crisis such as civil unrest are exactly the same qualities that are needed to be able to tackle the upcoming climate crisis. So with that said, I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Michael. Our next speaker is Robert Baines. Robert is the president and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, which is one of the co-sponsors for today's event. In his role as president, Robert is tasked with communicating the importance of NATO and the international rules-based order to Canadians. He has been a director of the Canadian-Turkey Business Council since 2017 and is the former executive director of the Canada-Albania Business Council and corporate development officer at the NATO Association. So Robert, why don't you take it away?
Thanks so much, Justin. I really appreciate that. Thrilled to be on this panel, and I'm going to try to weave in some of the discussions of our other panelists. Basically, in considering the growth and the growing impact of climate change on NATO, I'd like to dwell briefly on the multilateralism that has been an important factor in maintaining global peace and security since the signing of the Atlantic Charter by Churchill and Roosevelt in 1941. Out of the death and destruction of the Second World War came an ecosystem of institutions based on non-zero-sum collaboration. As one of those institutions, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, has been an essential tool for maintaining global peace and security. Now, NATO is based on the simple idea that peace can be maintained through strength of allies, and that an attack upon one is an attack upon all. In this way, a threat to one becomes a threat to all. NATO's great genius has been its ability to adapt and change according to different security threats. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg hosted a major event 3 weeks ago on the security implications of climate change, so very time sensitive for us. The Secretary General himself has significant background in environmental issues, which make NATO a great platform for this. The Secretary General previously served as Deputy Minister for the Environment in Norway, and he also served as UN Special Envoy on climate change. He draws attention to 3 reasons that NATO is concerned with climate change. 1, climate change makes the world more dangerous, which has already been demonstrated during this talk. 2, climate change makes it harder for our military forces to keep people safe, and specifically our military safe as well. And 3, climate change is everyone's responsibility. It should be, its burden is on the shoulders of NATO as well. NATO is dealing with each of these independently, considering that climate change makes the world more dangerous, especially because of extreme weather, as already discussed. NATO is adding extra stress on militaries as they are increasingly expected to deal with natural disasters. So NATO is really integrating climate change into its military planning and exercises. The second reason that NATO is dealing with climate change, it makes it more difficult for NATO countries to keep their people safe. This is evident by increasingly extreme weather, as has already been discussed, but also that soldiers and equipment must face these weathers, these environments when they're out on operations. That means equipment breaks down, people can't deal with the various situations. That can be a direct opposition to the operations. Finally, NATO is also dedicated to fighting climate change through helping to shoulder the burden of cutting emissions. The supply of fuel is a traditional vulnerability to all military logistics, and this also meets the urgency of reducing reliance on fuel. NATO is running something called the Green Defense Framework to explore and share the best practices in using solar panels, batteries, and various other elements that can help reduce this dependence. It is also working to contribute towards the goal of reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050. They're exploring how to keep helping other allies reduce their military carbon footprint without hindering effectiveness, essentially. This looks to include a calculation of the carbon output of NATO member militaries, and then to set voluntary goals to cut emissions. Obviously, this means that there's a lot of moving parts working towards dealing with climate change. NATO is taking the risk seriously and has great leverage to make change with half of the world's economy, including 1 billion people in the 30 nations that are member countries. So that's just a smidge of how NATO is approaching it. But I think once we see how much an organization dedicated to defense is taking this seriously, it's really a very good sign, but it's one that we have to see through. Thanks so much, Justin.
Thanks, Robert. Our next speaker is Paul Stevens. He's the president of Think Renewable Group, and he's the co-founder of the Climate Solutions Action Network, or ClimateSAN. I think I got that acronym right. That's our other co-sponsor today. He's an engineer by training, and Paul began his career focused on environmental-based business technologies, including a new medical waste processing technology that he himself developed. Following the tragic events of September 11, 2001, Paul became increasingly interested in the role that technologies and renewable resources could play in stabilizing conflict zones around the world. Initially focusing on Afghanistan, he eventually expanded his work to include parts of Africa. In his role at ClimateSAN, Paul facilitates investments in solutions that mitigate climate change. So, Paul, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Justin. Hello, everyone. As you've heard, the expected impacts of climate change are very dire, and the action on a global scale is really needed. Fortunately, there are many technology and nature-based solutions that can be implemented on the scale. To help illustrate what can be done on a very large scale, we've prepared this short video for you. And so now I'm going to share this video, and so that you guys can see it. Here we go. And let me just verify that sound is shared. Here goes.
We agree with the climate security and intelligence experts that the consequences of climate change are dire if we do not take action on a global scale to mitigate this change. Fortunately, solutions already exist that, if implemented on a global scale, could launch us into a sustainable future for all. There are a wide range of solutions available now, many of which can be grouped into 3 main categories: decarbonization of industry, energy storage, and carbon sequestration. Luckily, there's been massive progress in technology relating to these fields. Many technologies and nature-based solutions are available now and can be implemented on a global scale. Here are some examples. Green hydrogen-related technologies can dramatically reduce carbon emissions in transportation, manufacturing, and shipping industry, since hydrogen does not create any carbon emissions when utilized. For example, now you can purchase long-haul transport and local delivery trucks that are powered on hydrogen. As well, there is now a steel production plant powered by hydrogen. Energy storage technology has been rapidly developing, with the cost of battery storage plummeting in recent years. Based on data published by Bloomberg NEF, the cost of battery storage technology has dropped by 76% since 2012, making the combination of renewables and energy storage more financially viable. This storage can enable a massive increase in renewable power generation, which would eliminate the need for many fossil fuel power plants. This energy storage comes in many forms, including pumped hydro, compressed gas, electrochemical batteries, and thermal storage. As we transition into a low-carbon economy, we can draw down our existing emissions through carbon sequestration through the use of technologies and practices to accelerate natural solutions. Examples of this are rapid tree planting with the use of aerial drones, regenerative agricultural practices, and wetland restoration. A 2020 report by the World Institute shows that regenerative farming and grazing systems, if achieved globally, would draw down more than 100% of current annual CO2 emissions. Other options include artificial direct air capture, which removes carbon dioxide directly out of the ambient air, and carbon capture storage, which removes carbon dioxide out of the gases emitted from industrial processes. The need for climate change mitigation is urgent. The technology and nature-based solutions are ready, and they need to be implemented immediately, simultaneously, and on a global scale. We need large-scale action for this large-scale problem, and the sooner we start, the smaller the impact on present and future generations. The time to act is now. For more information about solutions that can be implemented on a global scale, visit climatesan.org/CSG.
Oh, so the link that we mentioned at the end of the video, climatesan.org.csg, is short for climate solutions that can be implemented on a global scale. On this page, we included a considerable amount of information, including a major initiative called Project Drawdown. This initiative includes much more detail about what can and should be done to mitigate climate change. So I encourage you to take a look at it if you have time. As indicated in this video, many climate solutions that can be implemented on a global scale, and we really need to do it now. So the response to COVID-19 has shown that when most people agree on what needs to be done, substantial action can occur quickly. Therefore, I think it is realistically possible to rise to the challenge on climate change, but we need to get moving fast and on a global scale. So much more needs to be done in the next 10 years than we've done in the last decade. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And ClimateSAN, Climate Solutions Advancement Network. I think I said action. I assume it's both, but you are the advancement network, so that's important to note. Our final speaker this afternoon is Steve Waygood. He's the Chief Responsible Investment Officer at Aviva Investors. Steve is a member of the CIO Investment Committee, and he founded Aviva Investors Sustainable Finance Center for Excellence, which seeks to transform capital markets in order to support long-term sustainable development. He is also a co-founder of the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, the World Benchmarking Alliance, the UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Coalition. So Steve, you are our final speaker of this afternoon, so take it away.
Thank you, Justin. And I'd also like to thank Paul very, very warmly for the invitation to be here. It is because of Paul that I happen to be here. So I've been asked to think through for you how insurance relates to this issue around security. So of course, we're most concerned about economic and financial security. And as an insurance business, we have a small army of actuaries plotting the changing physical environment and how the economic consequences of that pan out. We were created in 1696, believe it or not. And over that time, parts per million of atmospheric concentration of CO2 have risen from 270 parts per million to now 410. Now, where we seem to be heading with the business as usual scenario is much closer to in excess of 1,000 parts per million if we were to consume all the proven and probable reserves of the listed and unlisted oil and gas companies. This simply can't be allowed to happen. This is much closer to a 4, 5, and 6 degree scenario, at which point we're dislocating significant proportions of the world's population. So as an insurer and as an investor, we recognize everything that was said by James and his colleagues in the preamble to this debate that we're about to have. So we are extremely worried, not so much because of the pandas and the polar bears, as others are beyond this conversation, but we are much more worried about our long-term shareholders, and we're worried about the implications of climate change to the insurance sector. It represents unquestionably an existential crisis to our sector. So as a concerned financial institution, we modeled what the long-term implications could look like. And back in 2015, we worked with the Economist Intelligence Unit, and we modeled together that the long-term consequences of a 6-degree shift by the end of the century would erode a present value of 43 trillion off the stock of assets. And that estimate is now felt to be too low. And that's a third of the stock of manageable assets. This is a significant problem. So we've been looking at how finance itself is structured, looking to see how we can address its myopic short-termism, which is when one looks, for example, at investment analysis, most analysts forecast 3 to 5 years in their discount cash flow analysis, and then assume all things will continue to grow forever at a mean growth rate. Now that's clearly not consistent with the current climate crisis. So how do we address that? Fortunately, we now have a political plan in the form of the Paris Agreement that sets out a political vision and a political process, and countries are encouraged to do nationally determined contributions. Unfortunately, it doesn't set out a practical financing plan. The financing conversation is huge. You've heard it touched on already a few times in this debate, but we need to shift over $1 trillion a year, every year, until 2030 and well beyond, to put the global economy onto a net zero basis. Now that isn't aid, that isn't, if you like, philanthropy. That is an investment. But to mobilize that money, we need to create a plan. Now, one of the previous speakers touched on the fact that in 375 days from now, we have COP26 hosted in Glasgow in the United Kingdom. We hope to see that COP create a financial plan for mobilizing money so that we undergird rather than undermine the Paris Agreement. not, as I say, for the pandas and the polar bears, but because of people's pensions, savings, and investment, as well as, of course, security. Thank you, Justin. Back to you.
Thank you very much. And that is everybody. We're going to turn to questions in just a minute. I think that whole, all those presentations wrapped up pretty well. Both a lot of the threats that militaries and governments are facing, but also, some of the potential, the desire and the potential for actual action to address those things, and the ways in which governments and militaries and military alliances even can put forward a lot of those plans, actually more progressively than I think we give them credit for. Before we get to the questions, I do have one more bit of housekeeping, and I just want to let you know that in early 2021, ClimateSAN will be hosting an online conference examining this topic in greater detail. So if you're champing at the bit for more information, just stay tuned until early 2021. They'll be highlighting strategies and technologies that can facilitate action on a larger scale. The NATO Association of Canada and the Modern War Institute at West Point will be the co-sponsors of the event. Just watch your inbox for more information and make sure you're in the loop. We're going to move on to some of the questions. There's already a whole bunch coming in. If you have anything that you desperately want answered, please put it in the chat, and I will do our best to get through all of them. We have about 15 minutes for questions. So I'm also asking our panelists to keep your answers relatively short as possible, so we can get through as many questions as we possibly can. I want to start, I'm going to wrap together a couple of the questions I'm already seeing in the chat, and it's about some of the more specific threats that governments and states and militaries are going to be facing over the next couple of years. We have one question in here about radicalization from Leif Rosenberger, and this is specifically for John Conger, so maybe we'll start with you, John. It's a question about how climate change might actually affect Western nations, NATO missions, even SOCOM missions in countering violent extremism in Africa. Obviously, fewer resources you have, the more competition for those resources, the more you may see extremist or criminal organizations stand up and start, basically fighting for those resources. So John, maybe you can speak a little bit as to how some of those trends might play out, especially in the African continent.
So I think that what you see is a trend towards the use of these situations to their advantage from violent extremist organizations. If there's water scarcity in a region, they take control of the water and then use that leverage over the local population. They also use it for recruiting. And so they use these scarcities and these stresses as ways to influence the population. And they also use these stresses and these vulnerabilities to recruit populations, since when you have economic troubles and so on. All of these factors are things that the NATO and other special operations and other peacekeeping forces need to take into account as they enter into an area and as they evaluate what they need to do. But it is an amplification of the threat that needs to inform the response.
And James, maybe we can just turn to you really briefly. We're talking about a lot of the issues on a pretty big global scale, but of course, these threats and the scarcity of these resources and some of the the actual extreme weather events or scarcity issues are going to play out very differently in different places around the world. I wonder if you could zoom in a little bit into some areas where we might see some of those issues most acutely. And so this is for James.
All right, let me try to tackle that, I guess. In terms of where we might see some of the resource constraint concerns, or the perhaps I can address it by also looking at what Leif had asked about the COVID response and how that might be taking away from how we deal with climate change. And what we've seen, though, is that I can't see specific numbers in terms of, in such a short time where we're seeing an impact, but we know there's not enough resources flowing to dealing with the issue. But what we're seeing in the responses, and we've done some work with the Japanese government on a redesign platform to help governments share information and best practices. We're seeing that the recovery is why it might have taken some time, the COVID recovery, to address this issue. They're full on now trying to address the responses in a way that deals with climate change. bulk of what we're seeing in the responses we're getting from countries who have all been asked to provide information to the UNFCCC is in the area of mitigation. So my answer would be most likely, and this is a trend that we've seen some time, a lot of focus on mitigation. And as I said in my earlier remarks, it's the resilience, it's the adaptation, it's the dealing with what we're seeing already, where we're not addressing it adequately. And that's probably going to be amplified going forward if we don't change the curve in terms of the resources we're putting towards that. And I'll leave that as my answer if that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe Michael, the map you presented, I think, showcased a lot of those regionalist issues in a really kind of succinct way. But of course, there's all sorts of variables that goes into what state is going to experience some of these impacts more drastically than others. Emilio asked a question about how coastal cities in particular are going to experience rising tides, changing weather, extreme weather events, hurricanes. Maybe you can talk a little bit about just both geography, areas of concern, and kind of maybe even more broadly how the global South might have to grapple with some of these issues, and maybe what groups like NATO or the UN can start doing to help ameliorate some of those inequities that lead to some of those countries experiencing these things more acutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And, with kind of sort of with regards to the first map and it being somewhat of a misrepresentation, when we're only taking into account the exposure component, it can kind of sort of lead to us missing some critical gaps. For example, let's say Sierra Leone is a country that's identified as having a single ecological threat, as is Germany. But in the case of Sierra Leone, it's 95% food insecurity, right? With a quarter of the population being undernourished, whereas in Germany, it's floods and one person sort of died in 2018, essentially. So, bringing in the underlying resilience component is extremely important there. And with regards to resilience, I mean, what we see, which is once again not necessarily a surprise, is that it's incredibly situational, right? And it's incredibly contextual. Now, we're limited when trying to do sort of a global study like this by globally comparable data. So it is necessary to sort of do the same analysis at an individual country level. But once again, recognizing that the characteristics of resilience are just so much more broad than those related to security and even development as well. So yes, is that good?
Yeah, that's great. Well, and I think nowhere we're going to see the magnification of a lot of these threats and a lot of the impacts of climate change more acutely, as Sherry pointed out, than right here at home in the Canadian Arctic. You're looking at a massive melting of sea ice that could not only impact global climate, but also, of course, opens it up for the Canadians, the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, and everyone's cousin to start moving, commercial goods and potentially, military equipment through the Northwest Passage and in the Arctic Sea. And Sherry, we have a whole bunch of questions here about what the net result of that might be. Everything, from what the actual impact may be to global security of that passage opening, to even just a question about, whether or not we're taking into account, and Tamara Lawrence is in there asking whether or not we're taking into account the impact that the military use of that passage might actually have in terms of shipping and so on and so forth. So, Sherry, maybe you can just zoom in a little bit more on the Arctic and some of the challenges and opportunities presented there, and how we're going to start actively mitigating some of those challenges.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, let's put the challenges in terms of three buckets. The first is the absolutely devastating ecological risk that we face in the Arctic with rising temperatures, retreating sea ice, and thawing permafrost, which is going to have already devastating impacts on both human and wildlife security. We've relocated in Alaska already an entire village, which will be the first of many in Newtok, Alaska. It's not even in the Arctic, Alaska, but rising waters took away the whole town dock and the fresh water system, and the whole village moved of 400 moved 9 miles upriver at a cost that's not reasonable to do for all these villages. And we've had also in Louisiana a similar village taken over by rising sea levels in the bayou. So we're going to see increasing evidence of sort of the human security element on indigenous peoples and on other infrastructure throughout the Arctic, and of course on ecological diversity that has so relies on the permafrost and the sea ice. Now let's talk about what I think of as sort of the nearer term, in the next several decades, some of the big risks that we face. And I'll tell you the story that a Canadian Coast Guard officer told me at an last year. We were at NATO's first Arctic Strategic Foresight Workshop, the first time that NATO 29 member countries came together to discuss the Arctic, because most NATO members aren't actually Arctic nations, okay? And the Canadian officer said, the thing I really most worry about is somebody in a pub in London having a little too much, getting on a dare with his friend, and then they come up somewhere in the Canadian Arctic, and all of a sudden I'm dispatching my helicopters to go and rescue this guy and his friends, rather than doing the missions that support my local area. So I think as you have increased human presence in the Arctic, there are more risk of accidents. The one that keeps me up at night, and that we did an actual tabletop exercise on with the U.S. National Academy of Sciences last year, is the possibility that as the Bering Strait between Russia and the U.S. Alaska becomes more accessible for shipping and navigation, and Russia continues to nuclearize its activities in the Arctic, having many nuclear icebreakers, floating nuclear power plants, and it has said it's going to escort vessels throughout the northern sea route along its coast, that there could be an accident involving a nuclear icebreaker and maybe a Chinese liquid natural gas vessel shipping energy from Yamal back to ports in Asia. And if that occurs in the Bering Strait, where at its closest point, the US and Russia are only 30 miles apart, that would be a transboundary incident, potentially an international incident. And we know the Russians don't have the best nuclear safety record, from Chernobyl to the Kursk. So would we know exactly what's happened right away? So those risks are real. And then, the third type of challenge we have is with the increased opportunities that some see, like Russia wants to create a toll road across the northern sea route. China has declared itself a near Arctic stakeholder. Could we enter a new era of geostrategic competition in the region in the future? And those are challenges that we faced in the Pacific, in the South China Sea. NATO has faced for a long time. We haven't yet had to really confront that in the Arctic, but the signs and the trends are certainly there.
Thanks for that. Robert, maybe we'll turn to you for a second. Obviously, with the patrols that Sherry is talking about, even just the need to go do some of those rescue missions, even the need to monitor Chinese or Russian movement in the Arctic, and potentially other areas as well. We're talking about sending warships, sending significant military resources, potentially building new bases in a pretty fragile ecosystem that we're also at the same time trying to preserve. There's a bunch of questions people are asking, about the overall CO2 emissions of our fighter jets, of our fleets, of our naval vessels. How do you create a system? How does the military start thinking about guarding against those threats, making sure that there is a general security in its own backyard, while also trying to address its own CO2 reduction efforts and get to that net zero emission target that it keeps wanting to meet?
Yeah, for sure. It's certainly the case that the militaries of NATO, just like any other military endeavor, are very, very carbon heavy and emission heavy. NATO is not a draconian top-down organization. It doesn't run the militaries of component members. So I mentioned briefly the Secretary General's comments on trying to create two different things. So one is a record and kind of monitoring situation of the different CO2 carbon emission footprints of the different militaries. And then the second being some voluntary goals. So these are not specific at all right now. I think Sherry also mentioned that that's going to be included in the next strategic concept. But this is the huge value of an organization like NATO. It has these abilities to curb the different operation procedures of different NATO countries, not through compulsion, but through voluntary adoption of best practices.
Thanks. Let's turn to you, Paul. What role is I think we often think of the military as kind of a black box. That sometimes it seems sort of far off. It has its own command structure. It feels a bit separate, but this is an area where we're going to have to start talking about scientific engagement, industry engagement, making sure that the military is plugged into the latest technology, the latest trends when it comes to CO2 mitigation. Even in the video you showed, carbon capture. I don't think we imagined the military having to engage fulsomely on carbon capture schemes just a couple of years ago. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what sort of solutions might actually end up plugging into our military infrastructure, and Leaf even has a question, whether or not there are currently any militaries using some of the the forward-thinking technologies that you sort of ran through in your presentation.
Yeah, well, I think I've been watching that the military has been quite active in learning what they can do, and I think that hydrogen is something that they're considering. I've read a number of articles about that, but I would say as the economic system starts to switch over, then the procurement from the militaries, they should be looking at what they can buy to help accelerate this process, as in hydrogen delivery vehicles, hydrogen powered delivery vehicles, and energy storage. You could save if you put in let's say a renewable energy with large energy storage, you could eliminate a lot of the need for the fuel, and for the military to send their fuel to remote places, it's very expensive for them. So I think when they look at the economics, they can also save a lot of money by switching to renewables and reducing their carbon footprint.
Great, and for the last question over to Steve, there's one question actually that comes from Paul Stevers, so it's nice to see our panelists asking questions of each other. He wants to know specifically about the International Platform for Climate Finance. He wants to know a little bit more about exactly what that program does, what that platform does, and why it's going to be so useful. And maybe you can even segue that into a little bit about how finance and the investment world and corporate Canada, America can actually play a role in kind of working hand in hand with militaries, with NATO, with security agencies, to make sure that the funding, the investment, and the partnerships are there, in order to decarbonize and reduce that CO2 footprint.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Paul. I'm conscious of the time. I'll try and be as brief as I possibly can. The need to mobilize private finance and public finance to deliver the Paris Agreement and mitigate climate risk is phenomenal. It's huge. It is 4 times the entire Apollo program plus the entire Marshall program each year for the next 15 years in current prices. Those are the sums that we need to be shifting now. At the moment, whilst the Paris Agreement is a beautiful political ambition, as I mentioned earlier, it isn't a financial plan. Countries are not required to set out what they need in their nationally determined contributions, what demand they have for capital, and financial institutions who claim to support Paris are not required or even encouraged to set out an institutionally determined contribution about what kind of capital they can supply to what types of infrastructure and where. That is the issue we need to resolve. And as Aviva, we're working with some of the government officials proposing the creation of this new mechanism, an international platform for climate finance that would be launched in Glasgow with the support, I would hope, of hundreds, if not thousands of financial institutions who can be encouraged to produce institutionally determined contributions that sets out how they will help deal with this problem for their shareholders, as well as for the future, as well as for future generations and for the environment and society beyond. This is an existential crisis. We need to treat it like the emergency that it is and act at pace and scale, not question the science. The science is clear. The security issues are profound. We should be collaborating collectively to deal with this. Justin, back to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. I think that is all of the time we have for this afternoon. I tried to get through as many questions as I could, and if we didn't get to yours, I apologize. I hope that at least someone on the panel managed to address it at some point. But I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us this afternoon. I'm not sure if anyone's taking over for me or if I'm going to say the goodbyes, but thanks to James, Sherry, John, Michael, Robert, and Paul and Steve. I almost forgot Paul. I hope this was an enlightening conversation. I know I've already learned a lot. Thank you for everybody who joined in.
Thank you.
Bye all. Thank you.